Welcome to the Copeland Coaching Podcast, where it's all about turning your job search into a slam dunk. Your host is Angela Copeland.
Welcome to the Copeland Coaching Podcast. I'm your host, Angela Copeland. On the phone with me today, I have Dr. Maya Beasley in Washington, D.C. Maya is the co-founder of the T10 Group, a diversity consulting firm. She's also a research professor and the director of Diversity 360 Initiative at the University of Maryland. She earned her A.B. from Harvard University and her Ph.D. in sociology from Stanford University. Maya, thank you for joining me today.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
Well, I'm so excited to talk with you today. I want to start off with a question. There has been a lot of news lately about Starbucks, and they recently closed all their locations at one time to offer diversity and inclusion training, which is crazy from a scale perspective. And I'm curious, from your perspective, is this sort of training the next step to moving forward to equality, or what should companies be doing to move forward in diversity and inclusion?
So as a consultant and a professor, I like the idea of D&I trainings, and we offer trainings. But the problem is that most of what we see out there today are unconscious bias trainings. And empirical research shows that at best they're ineffective, and they can actually have negative effects. So if you have a diversity training that's focused on resolving individual biases, they're not likely to actually affect attitudes towards a particular racial or gender group or groups. And instead, in the short term, people learn to respond in the politically correct way to questions about bias. But in the long term, they actually report increased hostility towards other groups.
Really? That's interesting.
Yeah, you're getting the opposite of what you were hoping for. And research also shows that unconscious bias trainings have no positive, significant effects on organizational dynamics, like increasing hiring, retention, or promotions for underrepresented groups, and in some cases actually have significant negative impacts on these measures.
Wow.
So, you can see this kind of thing. For example, last summer we had the whole Google debacle where that idiot ran off and wrote a memo that was offensive. But he did that in response to having taken an unconscious bias training. And I'm in no way suggesting that, any of what he said was reasonable or appropriate, and I don't think what he did was acceptable at all. But I wasn't shocked because I already knew from the research that this stuff causes a backlash. People are annoyed. They don't want to be there. The people that are more likely to be receptive, so women and people of color, are also less likely to be people that would have acted on their biases anyway, and they're more likely to have been sensitive to those issues to begin with. But you just cannot train away biases that have developed over a lifetime in 2 hours or in 2 days. It just isn't going to happen. What you can do is you can offer trainings that provide different actors with actionable tools to mitigate biases within organizations. So you could talk about how HR can search for and recruit diverse candidates. You could cover ways that hiring managers can structure interviews. You could work with employees from marginalized groups to identify the resources that are available to them within organizations and provide them with techniques for networking and dealing with biases. Or you could do things like work with the board and senior leadership to help them build relationships with individuals and affinity groups that could serve as future organizational leaders. But I think that is much more effective than trying to pretend that if we sit in a room and we repeatedly say, "Hey, we all have biases. We just have to watch out for them," that's going to do anything. It doesn't do anything. And I've actually walked out of unconscious bias trainings, and people were telling racist jokes on the way out.
Oh, my goodness.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not going to lie. This was not the the response I was expecting. But it makes total sense, and these are really good suggestions. And I think, as a note, I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, I think that the memo that you're mentioning with regards to Google, there was an employee at Google who wrote a memo. I'm kind of going from memory. It seems like he wrote a memo about why maybe women were not as good in technology jobs. Is that what it was? Okay. And so there was a lot of press and media around, how could this person write this memo, and is this what the technology world believes or not, and kind of uncovering some of what's maybe going on there. Is that the memo that you're talking about?
That's exactly what I'm talking about.
Okay.
And not only have you written a memo, but after there was publicity on it, we found out that there were a bunch of people that were following him, that there were whole support groups for, like-minded, ignorant people that, that felt the same way. And, not to minimize the problems with, having those folks around, but clearly having an unconscious bias training didn't have a positive impact on that. But, we could have had trainings where we talked about how do you identify actors within your organization who are displaying bias in ways that impact other employees. Because, for example, he had a say in other people's promotion and their annual reviews. And so if you're able to understand that, then you can mitigate that bias, not necessarily by firing that person. That's up to the organization, but by saying, hey, while you don't have a handle on this, you can't be on any kind of personnel review again.
Mm-hmm.
Like that's as far up the ladder as you go. You can't be involved in working with other people's careers and managing them because this is a real issue, or finding other ways to make sure that any kind of bias that he would display or would put out there, that's again mitigated in some way. And there are lots of different tools that you can use, but you're just not going to train them out of them. That's unrealistic.
That's interesting. Well, speaking of tools, you recently spoke at South by Southwest, and you were part of a panel that gave a talk called Beyond Transparency, Leveraging Diversity Data. And I'm curious, when it comes to tools, are companies using data to improve their diversity? And if so, how are they using it?
So, right. So actually, most companies are not using the data. It's hard to tell who's doing what because there's not a lot of transparency. So, aside from the title of the talk, there's really only a handful of companies that are providing their numbers. But that doesn't mean that they don't have the numbers, that they're not aware of them internally and concerned about them. But there really aren't that many that are publishing those numbers. I think it's below 3% of the companies that are in the Fortune 1000 that are actually publicly releasing that information.
Wow, 3% is really low.
Yeah, it's really low. So, that on its own is problematic. But, the other issue is, well, what do you do with that data? So aside from transparency and being able to say, hey, we increased or decreased this year, and in most cases it's stagnant. But aside from being able to say that, what we want to know is what had an impact on those numbers if there was actually a change, and we're not getting that. So we don't know, for example, which practices are most impactful and how companies are using that information. And I know there are some companies that actually do evaluations of their internal programming, but I don't think that they're not doing that much. Oftentimes, it'll be something that's internal programming for for interns or something. So they're trying to figure out how bringing in female engineers or engineers of color over the summer is going to impact their hiring pool the next year.
Yeah, I think that's a
They
good
may well
question.
know, yeah, they may well know that, and in some cases, they're using that, and and they're doing well. But I tend to think if you're not publishing, a positive number, then that positive number doesn't exist, right? There's a reason that you haven't put it out there. But aside from that, I just don't think that companies are necessarily tracking that information, and this is what I think is really sad, that diversity is the one part of business where they will throw money at something and then don't see what their return on investment actually is.
That's true, actually. That's a really good point. And
Yeah, and it's it's highly problematic, because it's not to say that companies are throwing necessarily enough money at the issue, but you want what money they're putting into it to be effective. And they should want it to be effective, right? We don't want to have more news articles about how shameful someone's new diversity numbers are, and that's kind of thinning out as the years go by, and people are losing interest. But that's not effective. The shaming isn't effective. What's effective is actually empirical data that tells us this is what's working. This is how it had an impact, right? And they're not doing enough of that. And I think in some cases it's because, you have people that don't necessarily care that much, and so they've sort of done a yes, yes, yes. In some cases it's because they don't want to know, because they know it's not, what they've done wasn't effective. And in some cases I'm sure there are people that are really just kind of clueless and don't recognize it. But I think that's a harder one to believe, since these are business people, and they would always want to know what their return on investment was.
gosh, you'd think so. I mean, you mentioned bringing diverse people in the summers and how that maybe impacts your hiring later. It makes me think of a personal example, which is I worked in the summers when I was in college for General Motors as an engineer. And the first summer I worked there, I was in an assembly plant, and I was one of the only women. And honestly, it was one of my most fun jobs, but it was tricky because people would call me like that little girl, and the assembly line workers would like throw little plastic parts at me to try to get my attention as I would walk through the floor. And it was strange. It was kind of like they were trying to flirt, And when I graduated from college, they offered me a full-time job to manage an assembly line. And as much as I loved cars, I thought, how could I possibly manage the same assembly line that like throws pieces at me? Like, it's just impossible. And that was the reason that I left the automotive industry and moved on, was because even though they'd hired me to come in a couple of summers, there wasn't really a space for me. I mean, I don't know. Yeah. So that I think companies really have to fully understand the impact of kind of what they're doing. But anyway, you wrote a book, though. It's called Opting Out: Why America is Losing Out on Its Young Black Elite. And you explore the idea of income gaps between different groups, and you pose a really important question about why it is that Caucasians and African Americans have continued after the civil rights legislation for decades to have such large gaps in their income. And I honestly feel like we could probably do an entire episode about that. But kind of from your perspective, high level, like, what do you think is kind of causing some of this difference that we're continuing to see?
So some of it is still basic institutional discrimination, as in, James is a black man working as an investment banker, and he earns 65% of what Bill, a white man, earns. Right? That's real. That's still there. But some of it is that women and people of color are kind of pushed and pulled into a smaller number of lower paying and less powerful professions due to a number of things, right? Like access to social networks and resources that are crucial for upward mobility, a lack of awareness of opportunities, and also a feeling of needing to give back immediately to their communities. without recognizing how much more they could give if they had more influence and more resources. And I know some people have termed this the new black tax, but I think it applies to, a variety of other, race, gender groups. But what we really need is to end up with more diversified occupational portfolios for these groups, and that's the crux of my second book that I'm working on right now. And we start to see really drastic changes in the amount of inequality between well-educated white men and other groups if we just change the proportions of which occupations these groups go into, but we still hold constant the racial and gender pay disparities for each of these professions.
It's really interesting because I have a friend who we talk about this issue a lot, and I often say, gosh, it's so weird because all my friends who came from wealthy families ended up in these certain jobs, and those jobs happen to pay more. And why didn't anybody ever tell me that those jobs pay more? It's so simple. It's just a matter of, not completely, I'm oversimplifying, but part of it starts with what you pick to study in college, and what it sets you up for in terms of your job and how you sort of look at what you're using that college education for. And it's interesting because when I look at my classmates who did come from wealthy families, it's just, I'm like, how did they know? How did they all gravitate to the same jobs? And
it's just passed down to people. That's basic information that's passed down. And it could be specific conversations. It could be through people, looking around and just seeing what do your friends' parents do for a living? What do your parents' friends do for a living? What are the people in your community doing? And, and when they're talking about those things, around the dinner table or at some kind of community event, which of those things sounds interesting? Who's going to give you a summer job at their office that'll, expose you to it and show you whether or not you're interested in that specific job or something that's similar, or that you would want to do something completely different. But, we kind of assume that, that we can say things like, you can do whatever you want, you can be whatever you want, but people have to know what's out there to be really, whatever they could be. You can be whatever you want, but if that list is, 10 different professions, that's pretty limiting. And we don't recognize that. And I think that happens within families. It certainly happens within, within communities. It happens within, classes, that that kind of knowledge is just not passed down. And it's not because, the parents aren't trying to do enough or the community leaders aren't trying to do enough. They also don't necessarily know themselves. So,
yeah, I've seen a lot of stuff about sort of the hidden rules of social class. And I know that for me, growing up in a very sort of modest situation, I guess you could say, and then having gone on to be exposed to people through college and graduate school that were parts of different classes, I had to learn even just small behaviors that kind of set you apart or that would stick out, just making little tweaks. And it seems like it's things that shouldn't matter, but I think those things end up coming up when people are picking, or making decisions for hiring or who they want to be friends with. Or, I think it's so complicated. In your book, you actually have a chapter about family effects, and you pose the question, is it really just a matter of money? Or in addition to money, how can our family impact our career? And I'm curious, is this kind of what you're talking about when you talk about family effects? Is it the knowledge that's passed down?
Right. It is the knowledge that's passed down, but it's not just the knowledge from your family. It's from the people that are in your community, and that is directly impacted by your family, right? So where you can live, where you go to school, has a lot to do with your family's socioeconomic status and your race. So residential and educational segregation is still around for people of color, except at the very, very top echelon of wealth. So there are lots of middle class and even upper middle class people of color that live in areas that have lower tax brackets and fewer professionals than their white counterparts. And, that means that there's, fewer dollars going into the school, but it also means that there's less exposure to other adults in the community that have a diversity of professions and, professions that, we would think have more influence, more power, have more earning potential. And we want our kids to be aware of all the options that are out there for them. It isn't that it's just a matter of living next to, any white person that is the benefit of integration. I mean, you can certainly make an argument about, like racial well-being and, interracial communities and the, the basic benefits of those things. But in terms of upward mobility for different racial groups, it's not about just having white people in your neighborhood. It's which white people are in your neighborhood, which other people of color are in your neighborhood. For women, it's what other, women, whether you're white or Black, Latino, or Asian, what other women are you exposed to that have certain jobs? Because some of it is just being able to see that there are other people that look like you that are in different careers so that that you'll be able to get ahead. Because women and people of color also tend to prime our children about discrimination. And I think that that's absolutely necessary. It's really important to do because it's going to happen eventually. And it's a terrible wake-up call when it does, like having, strange things thrown at you when you're working on an assembly line. But I think if that's not tempered with teaching them about how to be resilient through those things and that it's still important to get past them or push as hard as you can, then we have a problem. And so, making sure that people have lots of different types of role models that are around, so it's great to have, people from all different class backgrounds, all different professions that we're exposing our children to. And, that goes the same for, when we're talking about families, but, your family is only so large, but who your family is and where they're able to live and what they're able to provide for you has profound impacts on what your social networks look like and what exposure you have.
I totally agree. And I think, it's even having the support of your family. I noticed, or the people around you, I noticed for myself, deciding to move from Oklahoma to New York to study, math and science I didn't get as much support as I was expecting. I did have people discourage me that I shouldn't be moving away, that I shouldn't be studying science and math. I happen to be very headstrong, so I did it anyway, but I don't think everyone has sort of that luxury to ignore that negative feedback and that kind of pull that keeps you.
Absolutely. And that, I think that's actually something that really transcends race because what I found was that white women in particular were more likely to have mothers who would be less encouraging about their academic and career pursuits.
Wow.
And especially if they came from, middle or lower middle class or lower income family backgrounds.
Why was that?
So they'd kind of push, that they were going to have a family eventually. And so you don't want to be involved in something that's, too high power because you're not going to have the time and this will sort of be a waste. And while most of the women that I interviewed who talked about that also had fathers who were, really strongly encouraging of them, which I think is, partially how they ended up where they were. That's still in the back of your mind that you have another parent, and it's the female parent who's been, probably the primary caretaker, who's telling you that you shouldn't do this, and who's not as supportive of it. And so, it is really problematic. I think it's less likely to happen for women of color because they've had to work. There hasn't been a choice for whether or not Black and Latina mothers can work. just because of basic economic disparities and discrimination. But for white women who are making a choice, even if it's a choice within, a sort of a basic middle class family, having that mom that's saying you shouldn't make another decision, that this is what's most important, and you won't be able to do it if you go out and get this type of career. That's an immense amount of pressure.
Yeah, it's a lot of pressure. I don't mean to make this all about me, but I will say that when I went to college in upstate New York, I was forced to promise that I would never go to graduate school. That was the deal. I could go to this big school in New York if I promised to never go to grad school. And I knew I was going to go to grad school, but I promised because I had to get away. And then I immediately started looking into my grad school options, as soon as I got there. But it was really hard. And honestly, I think I saw something you wrote. It reminded me of my experience, which was anytime I had a tough time in school, I remember my family saying, "It's okay, you can quit, you can come back, it's fine," rather than get in there and try harder, you're going to stick it out. And it was an experience. But, well, I want to jump to another question about technology degrees. And because, I love technology degrees. And you were actually quoted in a New York Times article about technology degrees where it specifically explored the idea of why those degrees are not actually putting more Black and Hispanics into technology jobs. And I'm curious, based on your research, why do you think this is?
Well, so I think that there's a couple of things. I mean, one is that there is a misnomer about how many Blacks and Hispanics are actually in tech professions right now. And so if we only look at Silicon Valley, which has a terrible diversity problem, then we're not recognizing that there are other tech hubs that have much larger proportions of people of color that are working in them. And so these people are getting jobs, or a good chunk of them. So other areas are doing better. But that said, there are still real problems, and so some of it is about what schools are providing to students. So it's one thing if let's say you're getting your degree in computer science, and there's a core curriculum, and the core curriculum can be really fantastic, and it'll likely look fairly similar across universities, depending on what tier or how rigorous the school is. But they're going to have some basics in there. But then there's a bunch of electives that people still have to take within their major. And those electives are really important in terms of what kinds of jobs you can get afterwards. And that's something that isn't necessarily being imparted to students while they're there. And it's something that is more likely to be imparted by a mentor, which is also something that women and students of color are less likely to have. So if you look at 100 electives that are available to you, and it says pick 10 that you're going to take, and you take a bunch of theoretical classes, then it's likely that a lot of the tech firms are going to look at you afterwards and go, well, we can't use that. I mean, it's great that they got a degree from this top school, but they don't have any practical experience, right? Mm-hmm. It's all theoretical. Whereas, a little bit of guidance about, hey, you're thinking about becoming a software engineer, right? That's what you want to do for the next 5-10 years of your life. Here are some courses that are directly relevant to it. And, by the way, take a look at the job descriptions or the job postings that are out there for the firms that you're thinking about. What are your dream jobs? Where do you want to work? They're telling you have to have taken these types of classes and had these types of experience. And that's just not being translated between the universities and the employers.
That's interesting.
Yeah, it's an easy fix, I think. Some of it is literally just providing guides. So I just had a really good conversation with someone from one of the major tech firms about just making sure that you're providing guides for students that you can provide to the universities, because the universities if they're not going to do it, you do it. If you want to diversify, you put in the extra several hours to creating this guide for students that are underrepresented at your firm, so that they know this is what I need to be able to take in order to get a job here. And then some of it is about making sure that these students actually have mentors, right? Because it's not that white and Asian men automatically know the right courses to take. I mean, they didn't just wake up one morning and say like, hey, I should take XYZ class, and that's going to do it. It's because somebody's telling them, you really need to take this class if you're hoping to get this job.
Mm-hmm.
And right now, like I said, we don't see as many mentors available for women and people of color. And I think, part of the fix for the university is to simply make that a mandate. I mean, mentoring students is already a mandate for people's jobs in many cases. But mentoring which students is not mandated. That's not necessarily part of your promotion tenure review, and it should be. So you shouldn't be able to just pick out that you're only going to work with white men as a faculty member. If you want to be promoted, then every year when you put down how many people you've mentored, and that's put into the equation of what your pay raise is or whether or not you're going to get tenure or promoted. In the same way, we would want to see, well, what proportion of those people were women and or people of color? And if it doesn't meet a certain threshold that the university, figures out based on what their student populations are, then you don't get that promotion. You don't get that raise. It's a simple thing, and I'm sure that there will be faculty that are, disenchanted by having to do that, but that's just the way it goes. And I mean, I can see this in all sorts of different disciplines, but in tech disciplines, you see it a lot, and frankly, it's done with less malice than it's done if you look at the social sciences.
Sure.
So it's that people are just completely oblivious, and they already have some kind of a bias, and they know like, hey, if I feel comfortable with this white guy or this Asian guy, and I know I've worked with people that look like him, and hey, they look like me, I want to have them on my team. And Bob worked with them last year, and he really liked this this kid, so I'm going to continue to work with these people. If they're sort of consistently getting that boost because people had some kind of unconscious preference to begin with, and I'm sure in some cases it's a conscious preference, but let's assume the best, and that there's a lot of unconscious bias going on. Again, we don't have to mitigate the bias by putting them in hours of training to make them not be bigots.
Mm-hmm.
We just need to say, hey, part of your job is to mentor people that look different than you, and do a good job of doing that.
Yeah, it sounds like, I've had people ask me lately, they'll say, Angela, I'm learning more about, diversity and inclusion, and say it's a white male, and he'll say, I'm not really sure though what I can do, like what's the thing that I can do to help make it better at my corporate job. And it sounds like one thing that you're suggesting is that they should be more proactive in mentoring, reaching out to, helping people who are different than them.
Yes, because while I think it's great if we can get a mentor that is same race, same gender, the reality is we don't have the numbers for that, and
right.
It doesn't mean that white men or Asian men or whatever the representation is, right? Whatever the majority is, it doesn't mean that they're not going to do a good job of mentoring someone that's different than them. We might want to provide them with additional resources so that they're aware of things that might pop up, or provide additional types of programming within organizations, whether you're talking about a university or a company, so that people can help figure out how to cope with bias in a way that that a white man might not be able to help you as much with, but they can certainly still tell you, hey, your resume looks good, or this is what you need to do to spruce up your resume, or this is what you should expect from going in for a job interview. Here, let's practice this, or or just having a basic conversation about, hey, what do you want to do when you graduate? let's map out a plan for how you're going to get there, and I'm going to keep an eye on you and, and monitor you. That doesn't take having a black woman, tell you what to do. That can be anybody who is knowledgeable in that field and wants to do it. We just have to make sure that people are willing and able to do that. And that's just a basic part of mentoring. So we shouldn't be relying or over-relying on, the smaller number of people of color and or women in these companies to now mentor all of the people that, that look like them.
Right.
That's not, that isn't fair to them. But, but we can rely on everyone and say, like, this is a group effort. Like, you want your teams to function well. You want people to stay in the jobs here. You want to make sure that all of the people that are graduating from your university are doing as well as they can. This is what it takes. And it's not a big ask.
Mm-hmm.
If you're already going to mentor, 10 people in a year, then all we're saying is they can't all look like you.
Right.
You don't have to be different. It's not, it's not that you have to take on a much bigger load, but, they can't all be the ones that you pick because you're most comfortable with those people.
No, it makes sense. It's interesting. There's a young woman who I know that was finishing college in Memphis a few years ago, and she moved to Dallas. And I introduced her to a C-level executive that I used to work for who was living in Dallas at the time. And he met with her about her job search, and he said, you need to wear this, you need to bring this kind of notebook, you need to bring your resumes, you need to, he was like really specific, and she shared that with me, and I thought, wow, these things sort of feel obvious, but I guess they're not, and it really helped her, and she landed a job really quickly with her skills given this extra sort of information. And I'm like, wow, that's amazing. And he was able to share that with her based on his experience as a C-level executive and knowing how the system works, essentially.
Exactly. So, there's plenty of topics that he might have a harder time dealing with if she comes in and says, I'm dealing with someone that's, sexually harassing me at work and I'm not really sure what to do. She might not want to approach him about that, or he may not really be clued in, or he's never dealt with that. But again, organizations can provide other types of resources for dealing with those race, gender specific issues. Mm-hmm. It doesn't get white men out of mentoring, and it doesn't mean that they wouldn't be perfectly wonderful mentors for people that are not white men.
Sure. It makes sense. Well, Maya, this has been excellent. You've shared so much great advice. I wish we could keep going, but if we'd like to check out your work and learn more about you, where's the best place to go?
So you can go to LinkedIn and check me out there, or you can look at, as far as I know, I think there's actually only one other Maya Beasley on LinkedIn.
Okay.
You can also find me at on our company website, the T10 Group. So it's the T as in Tom, 10 Group.com, and just be warned that the website is being revamped.
Perfect. Well, I will link to it in the show notes. And Maya, it has been so great. Thank you very much for your time today.
Oh, my pleasure. Thanks so much.
And thank you for listening. Please don't forget to help me out. Subscribe on iTunes and leave me a review.
Thank you for listening to the Copeland Coaching Podcast today with your host, Angela Copeland. Tune in next time to get more great tips on turning your job search into a slam dunk.